Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Randy Morger, and I have the distinct honor to chair the Greater Montana Foundation. And our foundation has the distinct pleasure of partnering with the Montana Historical Society to provide this special broadcasting symposium. The idea was spurred by completion and the formal dedication last evening of the Ed Craney studio at the Montana History Museum. That state-of-the-art facility was a collaboration between our foundation and the Historical Society, and its use by the Society and its guests will help foster better communications on issues of importance to all Montanans. And that's great because that's the mission of the Greater Montana Foundation. 55 years ago in 1958, broadcasting legend Ed Craney set up the Greater Montana Foundation to serve our state's citizens by focusing on ways to improve media's, primarily the electronic media's, reporting and documentation of issues, trends, and values that matter to many of us. Over the past 5.5 decades, GMF has forged close ties with Montana's commercial and non-commercial broadcasting communities, many independent program producers, our in-state broadcasting schools, and more recently, web-based services, alternative media, and other Montana organizations with similar or complementary goals. Ed Craney was an entrepreneur, an inventor, and a creator of change who loved the state of Montana and the broadcast industry. He started broadcasting in Butte in 1929 on KGIR, the third radio station to go on the air in Montana. He collaborated with longtime friend U.S. Senator Burton K. Wheeler of Montana to write the Communications Act of 1933, probably the most important piece of national broadcast legislation in the 20th century. By the late 1930s, Craney owned a number of radio stations in Butte, Bozeman, Helena, Missoula, and Great Falls, and he linked them together to form the first connected radio news network in the West. Then in the 1950s, he moved into the new medium of television, establishing a group of TV stations across Montana, as well as Spokane, Washington, and Portland, Oregon. He was also a philanthropist, collector, and donor of great Western art, some of which you can see on exhibit at the Craney studio over at the History Museum. His great ideas and efforts gave birth to organizations like the Montana Broadcasters Association, and another you'll hear more about in just a moment. In the very best sense, Ed Craney was a true Renaissance man. Ed died in 1991, but his legacy lives on. Today, his Greater Montana Foundation each year funds several $100,000 of commercial and non-commercial programming, sustaining grants, and special projects. Program support runs the gamut from hard news, documentaries, special events such as broadcast election debates and legislative coverage, public service announcements, cultural and historic programming. And we're increasingly involved with helping web-based communications. For example, last fall we underwrote a conference on aging in Montana. It was put on by the Wheeler Center and the One Montana organization. Our specific cut of the action was to fund the stand-up and operation of an interactive live statewide webcast of the conference, with people able to view and input questions and comments from, well, anywhere, even from the comfort of their own homes. Well, this was a first-time experiment for us. I'm advised that it helped result in the largest turnout the Wheeler Center has ever had for a conference, and on a subject that is certainly of high interest to many Montanans. Regardless of source, programs underwritten by the Greater Montana Foundation are freely available to the state's commercial broadcasters to bolster local and regional issues coverage. Additionally, the Greater Montana Foundation underwrites the Montana Broadcasters Association's annual awards competition to recognize excellence among state broadcasters. Our trustees donate significant time, energy, and talent to fulfill Ed Craney's ideals and the ongoing mission of the Greater Montana Foundation. And if I may be so bold, may I ask my fellow board members to rise and be recognized at this time. Stand on up. Thank you. You will see and hear from a number of our board members today. That's not hubris. It just turns out that when we talk about the history of broadcasting in Montana, key individuals who helped shape that legacy have also served and continue to serve on the Greater Montana Foundation. I'm reminded by Sid just before I came up here today that what a great setting for us to be in, because as it turned out, one of the pictures we saw in the history of Ed last night was that first broadcast from the old Supreme Court chambers back in the late 1940s, and wouldn't he be proud to have us in here today? In our annual meeting yesterday, the board members allocated $280,000 to support well over 20 projects and organizations that share our goal of fostering better communications for and among Montana's citizens. Our board members take great pride, and rightfully so, in the roles they play to bolster Montanans' understanding and engagement in key issues. And that's the basis of this symposium. And now to introduce our first speaker. Greg McDonald is the president and CEO of the Montana Broadcasters Association. He helps represent the interests of nearly 200 television and radio stations before the Montana legislature, the United States Congress, with regulatory agencies, and with the public at large. The MBA has been in existence since 1948, and Greg has been at the helm for the past 13 years. Prior to that, he was chairman of the University of Montana's Radio TV department, retiring from that position in 2000. He's originally from Detroit. He has a graduate's degree in broadcasting and journalism from the University of Michigan, worked at WGN in Chicago, and then moved over into the teaching field, where he got a broadcasting magazine ad for an opening in the radio TV department at the University of Montana. And just a couple of snippets, Greg, from your 40-year career spanning both the U of M and now the MBA. Greg co-founded Montana's Amber Alert Missing Child program. He taught broadcasting to most of the 9 Morger kids at the University of Montana. And Greg also admits to having once been an openly practicing thespian. Greg, the mic is yours, sir.
Thank you, Randy. You know, the thing about the opening practicing thespian has given me one great line that I've been able to use a lot of the times because we deal with a lot of legal issues, and that is, I'm not a lawyer, but I did play one on television once, and that is absolutely true. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I can't tell you what an honor this is, and quite frankly, how humbling this is, because I'm sitting here, and while I was privileged to have met Ed and knew him a little bit in his later years, and after he had divested his broadcast holdings, I'm looking out at people who knew him so much better than I did, obviously, worked with him very closely. And so, you know, now I'm like, oh boy, I better not get anything wrong here. I think a lot of you, maybe most of you, were at the presentation last night over at the History Museum. And it was wonderful, except that I had to go back to my room last night and totally redo everything I was going to talk about because I wasn't really sure what this was supposed to be about. I had some kind of mixed messages from Sid and Randy and probably my own head about what I was supposed to be talking about here today. And at one point, and this was never part of the equation in my mind, but it says, well, you're talking about the history of Montana Broadcasters Association. And I said, I don't know anything about the history of the Montana Broadcasters Association. And not only that, you know, about the least sexy thing in the world I can think is, you know, the history of a trade association. And so that wasn't real high on my list. But then after last night, I thought, well, you know, there is a lot about the Montana Broadcasters Association, and we've been around since 1948. And like almost all things broadcasting in Montana, Ed was clearly at the forefront of establishing that organization. And then listening to the presentation last night, it started to all come to focus, and I thought, well, there really is a very strong connection here, because several of the key projects, targets, you know, long-range goals that Ed embarked on going back to the 1920s, the early 1920s, are, for better or worse, the same things I deal with almost every day in the broadcast business. So I'm going to share just a little bit of how the past just keeps repeating itself and what we in the Broadcasters Association deal with, that Ed really laid the groundwork for and set a foundation to try to make sure that we can protect the industry that he was so proud of and was so important in establishing here in Montana. One of the things that you learned, if you didn't already know, was Ed's battle against the superstations. Superstations can be referred to a lot of different ways. Ed's battle was really against increasing power on clear channel stations. Now, Clear Channel stations, to many of us, are a whole different thing than the Clear Channel stations, being that big company out of Texas that is everybody's favorite whipping boy when it comes to too much, too big, too often. Clear Channel stations, for those of you who might not know, were, about a dozen stations in the United States. There were some in Canada, there were some in Mexico, but they were the highest power stations, and their frequencies were protected for 1,000 miles. Nobody could be on those frequencies. And they're the stations that some of us, as young lads with the little 6-transistor radio at night and the earphone under the pillow, were able to listen to in Detroit, Michigan, stations from Boston or Memphis or New Orleans or Cincinnati. And quite frankly, they were, wonderful for what they did. But there was a big move in the 50s and 60s to allow them, and most of those were 50,000 watt, and they were called 50,000 watt Clear Channel stations. By treaty, they could be 100,000, but the US government had limited them to 50,000. And there was a big plan to allow them to go to 500 or even 750,000 watts. And that was one of the battles that Ed fought, was to provide for more stations, more local stations, and not allow those giant companies to be able to come in, because there's only so much spectrum, there's only so much frequency, and when it's gone, and that is a perpetual issue that I'll get to a little bit more later. But that was one of Ed's big issues. And of course, it continues to be a big issue as we fight on a regular basis to manage that spectrum so that it is not affecting in a negative way local broadcasters. And it happens in a lot of ways. I'm always amazed when I come over here to Helena and I drive up from Missoula and up over the pass, and I'm one of those people that's, on my radio, scanning everywhere, and I'm listening to Ron Davis's stations from Butte coming over here, and the stations from Great Falls coming in here, and from Calgary, and from my friends in Deer Lodge in here. And I would tell my friend Dewey when I get there, I said, how do you even stay in business in this town? There's so much clutter on this dial. And then you add into that all of the people who would just like to drop in a little satellite from California or Atlanta or somewhere that creates more problems for local broadcasters. And make no mistake about it, as a Montana Broadcaster Association member and a longtime person working in this business in Montana, we're about local, free, over-the-air broadcasters. We're not about cable, we're not about satellites, other than the fact that, quite frankly, they are the people that we have to compete against and make sure we protect our part of the spectrum from. And that's something that began back in the 20s and all the way through Ed's career through the 70s. When he finally, I was thinking about this earlier, when he finally, retired from the business, but I don't think Ed ever really did retire from the business, because he had divested himself of his stations by the time I met him, but he always was a broadcaster, and he was always talking about the business, and that was obviously his love and passion. Ed also led the charge against the first of the what we refer to as the PROs, the Performing Rights Organizations, ASCAP, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. These are the people that broadcasters have, since virtually day one, paid cash money to compensate the, what else, composers, authors, and publishers. There was a catchy little name for ASCAP, right? And several other organizations now. But it was to, and the rationale behind that, and is to this day, those are the behind-the-scenes people who are involved in the music industry, but whose names you don't know. They're the writers of the music, the people who publish the music. And the idea behind the very long-standing historical rationale for paying those people and not the performers was because we paid the performers in another way. We've paid the performers since 1922 by playing their music free, promoting their names, promoting their concerts, promoting their 78 and then 33 and 45, now CD, and even online sales of their music. And so when you hear about those poor performers who just need a little bit more money from the broadcasters, you just need to remember that about a year ago, a friend of mine sent me the ad Alan Jackson, a little country guy you might have heard of, had built a new house, so he was selling his old house down in Nashville. And I don't know if it's still on the market, but if any of you have $38 million in your pocket, obviously Mr. Jackson did pretty well by the notoriety that he got on the broadcast airwaves in selling records and promoting his concerts. One of the things that came about, and you know, Molly talked about, you know, this was a 3% thing, they wanted 15, you know, it's a constant battle going on. But one of the things that happened about that was that she didn't mention, out of that whole fight came something called BMI, Broadcast Music Incorporated. They were the second pro or performing rights organization, and it was no mistake that it was Broadcast Music Incorporated because we started it as a way to compete with ASCAP. Now, they are also independent now, and we pay royalties to them, as well as CSAC, as well as to the online people for streaming of things. But let me tell you, that is an ongoing, continuing battle all the time. It has been for many years so contentious that there is a special court in the United States called the Rate Court that BMI, ASCAP, CSAC, the broadcasters all have to sit down literally with a judge to negotiate those royalties on a usually every 4 to 5 year basis. And one of the big issues that we have been fighting now for a number of years that literally goes back to those early fights of Ed Craney is the fact that the record industry, the Recording Industry Association of America, RIAA, would like nothing more than to add an additional layer to those royalties. We call it a tax, a performance tax. They get very upset by that, and they say this is not a tax, but we figure anything that the government tells you you must pay, regardless of who you pay it to, is still a tax, to pay royalties to those performers. And the rationale is, well, gee, the record companies just aren't making any more money. Well, it's because they don't know how to sell records anymore. Who goes out and buys records? Nobody even buys CDs anymore. They never quite figured out downloads and how to sell them. Now, it seems to me that Apple figured it out. The 4 giant record companies, and we always like to say all of which are foreign-owned, so we always refer to as the foreign-owned record companies, would like to add a tax to pay for those poor, starving artists who are still performing well into their 50s. Well, that's kind of what artists do, you know? They perform. What they don't tell you, and see, I'm hoping Ed's kind of like sucking this up, saying, yeah, you know, go after him, is 50% of the tax that they want goes not to the performers, but to the record companies. 45% goes to the headliner, with a whopping 5% going to all of those poor, starving background players that are still playing into their 60s and 70s, you know, so that they can get their 4-cent a month check that they probably will never get. Because the other thing on that is that you have to look at the fact that as much as we battle with the performing rights organizations, no artist has ever sued a performing rights organization to get their royalties. Virtually every artist has sued their record label, and I mean every artist. Elvis, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones have all sued their record companies for not paying them what they were even owed on their record contracts. So that's an ongoing thing. Where did it start? It started with Ed's battle with ASCAP. And the thing that I'm going to talk probably the most about, and maybe there'll be some questions, because this is something that's going to affect a lot of you. It affects almost everybody in Montana. Ed was the pioneer in broadcast translators. The man invented the concept of a broadcast translator. You heard a little bit last night. Federal Communications Commission didn't know what they were, didn't want them on the air. Little secret. Federal Communications Commission, most people still don't know what they are, still don't want them on the air, okay? He created the National Translator Association, which is an independent, it's not my association. We obviously are members, we support them, we work with them, but they're the people who protect translators. Translators are not, does anybody not know what a translator is? good. I kind of figured most of us do here in Montana. I grew up in Detroit. I had never heard of a translator. I went to work at the University of Montana and suddenly found out we had one. It's like, what is this thing that seemed to take most of the engineers' time because it was, gee, I guess you can't ever bet where the first translator from the University of Montana in Missoula was located. Top of XL Heights in Butte, beaming right into Ed Craney's house. That was not an accident, obviously, and in fact, Ed was the one who pretty much paid to put it in there. So anyway, today, you know, there are very few people outside of the Mountain West, because it's truly a Mountain West phenomenon. We have about 450 television-only translators in Montana. My friends in Utah have about 700. They're first, we're second. Wyoming, New Mexico, Arizona. We are the keys to translators. We have a little thing coming up because, once again, as I said, spectrum is key, and certainly the part of the spectrum that broadcasters occupy is considered the gold standard. It's the piece of the spectrum that everybody wants. That includes all the cell phone companies, all the data companies. I mean, you know the cell phone companies need a lot more spectrum because, boy, there's a lot more ringtone downloads they'd like to sell you that they just can't find a way to put on their put on the spectrum that they have right now. Did I mention I work for the Montana broadcasters, not the cell phone companies? I like my cell phone, but it's just, you know, I'm sorry, I don't need to be able to see everything in the world on it right now. So what's happened is that we are going to lose a portion of the spectrum. It's going to be taken by the FCC and auctioned off to the highest bidder for data and cell services. Our job is to protect all of the stations that are on there. Now, the government says, and the law says, this has to be a voluntary participation to sell your spectrum. But if not enough people volunteer, they can come in and say, well, you don't have to give up your spectrum, but we're going to move you. And some parts of the spectrum are better than others, and it also doesn't take into account that there's a lot of investment in that spectrum by stations, literally, you know, I mean, when you're in Billings, it's Q2 and color 8. People don't think of things. They think of where you occupy the spectrum. And so that becomes an issue, and there's no notion of what they're going to do with that. But when they were going through and deciding to do this, there was absolutely no provision made for low-power stations or translators. Now, a lot of you are probably from Helena. 3 of your 4 television stations are low power. They're not protected. They used to all be translators in here. You had 1 television station and everything was translators. There are a lot of towns in Montana that have no television unless they have translators. So we have spent the last 2 years nonstop talking translators to the point where my good friend Bill Lake, who's the head of the Media Bureau at the FCC, when he sees me across the room says, I'm working on those translators. I'm working on those translators. Because we brought the issue up because it's a rural issue. And frankly, any of you who have dealt with people in Washington, D.C., you know, everybody jokes about, well, you know, once you get outside the Beltway. Well, you know, in a lot of cases, once you get off the 8th floor of the Federal Communications Building, everything changes. We've brought FCC commissioners out here. We have brought the Media Bureau out here so that they could get some firsthand experience on how important translators are to the fabric of Montana. Again, these are stations that you would not get. Oh, and they'll say, that's fine, let them get satellite or cable. Well, a lot of those places you're never going to get cable. They're never going to cable it, and nobody's going to be cabling much anymore anyway. Last time I looked, yeah, you could get a special deal for, you know, maybe $49 from the satellite companies for the first 3 months, and then you're into them for $100+. There are a lot of people in Montana that's a fortune. We have one of the highest percentage, if not the highest percentage, of free over-the-air broadcast viewers only, no cable, no satellite, in the country, at over 20%. We have a disproportionately large number of senior citizens who tend not to want 150 or 500 channels of satellite or cable. They want to be able to watch their local news and programming. We have a large percentage of low-income folks. We have 7 Indian reservations that are served virtually exclusively by translators, in this state. And those are the kind of issues that I hope that Ed would be thrilled and proud to know that the association that he was a part of was still dealing with. And before I take any questions, if there are any, because I see Randy over there and I'm looking at my watch and trying to get through, I would also be remiss if I didn't mention some of you are aware of, especially the broadcasters, of one of Ed's continuing legacies. You've heard about the Greater Montana Foundation, which is, I think, has to be in its entirety his greatest legacy that continues, long past his passing. But one of the things that the Greater Montana Foundation started 51 years ago were the Broadcaster Awards, which we, about 15 years ago, changed to the EB Awards. Well, that was original, wasn't it, huh? Excellence in Broadcasting, Edmund Blodgett Craney. You can figure it out. And I just want you to know, that was 51 years ago. We'd been going along thinking it was, 35, 40, whatever, until Mr. Morger last year said, it's our 50th anniversary. I thought, we went back and said, wow, it really is. So we went from, like 43 to last year we did our 50th, and we always joked, said, well, maybe this year we'll do the 75th just for fun. But I would let you know that, just as a continuance of that whole thing is that those awards will be given tomorrow night in Big Sky, and we have a couple of hundred people coming down to see who actually will be honored for their excellent work in reporting and producing and production and public service and public affairs, and that's always an exciting time, and we're delighted to have some of the GMF able to be with us. Sometimes we get more, sometimes, but we always are delighted, and we have Dolly and Brody and his family, and Vic and Joanne Miller coming down, and I was delighted, as a recognition and honor of Ed, whom he never knew but did a lot of homework on. Some of you met Senator Smith last night, and we had been touring the Capitol, and he had kept commenting about how much he learned from broadcasting in the Senate from our former Senator Conrad Burns, because they were on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is the main committee that I deal with in the U.S. Senate. And Monty was able to hook up with Conrad this morning, and he's bringing him down to see the senator tomorrow. So it's going to be a pretty special night. And if you see the senator, don't say anything, because we're not telling him. Conrad's just going to show up to say hi. So anyway, it is with, as I say, I'm delighted and humbled to be here. I thank the foundation and certainly the Craney family for the opportunity. I hope that you can see from just these things, because we've got Congressman Daines coming down tomorrow afternoon, and anytime if any of you have dealt with any of the congressional people, the first thing they want to know is, what do you want them to talk about? What do you want them to know about? And I said, oh, gee, let's talk about cable retransmission agreements. Let's talk about performance tax. Let's talk about protecting our translators. And that's how we make sure that we keep that legacy going. So thank you very much. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, I know you've got a long program. And I'm going to apologize to all of the people coming up here, but we do have that little thing going on down at Big Sky. And so shortly after this, we're going to be hitting the road to get down, because we're meeting people and have to go through all the setup for the banquet and awards and all that. And I'll let you know, and I'll let you know through GMF, and if you just keep track on our website, we're actually recording the whole thing so that you'll be able to, probably within about a week, we'll have it up online, so that if you're not able to be there, you'll be able to go in and look at the entire ceremony. Within a couple of days after, all of the finalists' full awards will be up on the web. So we didn't want to take away from our live event by making that public, but if you haven't already made reservations, there aren't any more rooms left at the end, so you're not going to get in anyway. So thank you very much.
Any questions, comments, parting shots for Greg?
There you go. Yeah, Bill. Well, I love the internet. I don't have anything against the internet. I was one of the first internet users, I think, in Montana because I had some friends who were in a big forestry science lab over at the university who had, learned about this program Mosaic. If any of you remember Mosaic, which was the first internet browser, which was not the most user-friendly thing in the world, but I had one of the first internet accounts at the university, which again, the internet was really created mostly by universities and federal agencies to share scientific information. I think it's great, and I think there are wonderful opportunities for broadcasters to be able to use the internet, and most of them are. Like everybody else, the challenge with the internet has been, how do you monetize it? And that seems like sounds like a bad word. We just want to make money. Well, the bottom line is we just need to know how to pay for it before we even think about making money on it. And it's not inexpensive to do the technology in order to do broadcast, especially full-blown broadcast video programs, especially now in high definition. It's pretty substantial bandwidth and some pretty healthy equipment. But like everything else, computers have been one of those things that have gotten, bigger, or actually smaller, faster, and cheaper. And so we've been able to take advantage of that. Almost anybody can now own their own television station on the internet if they so choose for probably not more than about $2,500 bucks. You can go to Costco and buy a high-definition video camera for $400. Any laptop computer, there are $79 computer programs that literally allow you to edit high-definition video and do things that the $50,000 Avid editor, which was the first one I bought for the university, couldn't even think of doing. So the opportunities are there to share things. I think where the opportunities for Montanans especially are to show off this state to outside people. We've all had friends and relatives, they come here, and they've never been here. They don't know what Montana's about. And the same thing's true, I've never been, and it's not on my bucket list to go to Mississippi. But it probably wouldn't hurt to, kind of find some local news from Mississippi. When I said, when I drive over here, I'm scanning the radio, that's what I do everywhere I go. It drives my poor wife crazy, I'm sure, because we never listen to anything for more than about 40 seconds. And if it's music, and I love music, I don't listen to it. I don't listen to music. I throw in a CD or listen to my iPod. I want to hear the local news, and I want to hear the local commercials, because it tells me a lot about the community. If there's no advertising, if there's no commercials, I kind of figure there's probably not a great economy going on here. I was watching this morning, it was funny, watching something on the news, and there was a guy talking about, you want to find a great place to buy a house in a market that's coming? Go find out where Starbucks is going to build their next coffee shop, because they do all of this research, and they don't go into places that are on the downswing. They go to places that are coming up, and they don't go to places that are established because they're already there. They go to communities where the crime rate's going down and housing values are going up. They've done the research. That's where you buy a house if you want to relocate. And I thought, wow, that's brilliant. That is amazing. Well, I think the same thing is true. We can learn a lot about each other by sharing that. And, it empowers the listener and the viewer in ways that we didn't have before, because now I can, just as I said, in a week or so, you'll be able to go look at the EB Awards. I can now go and look at those things. A friend of mine sends me an email and says, hey, we had this really cool thing happen, here in Portland. And I just go in and I'll scan over and I'll go find one of the Portland stations, and boom, I can find something on it. So it allows us, I think, as citizens to be more connected. I don't see it as a threat to local broadcasters, because if local broadcasters are doing, I've been preaching this my whole time, and I thank you very much, Randy, for 40 years. I wish it were only 40. And it's actually 50. Hard to believe, but this fall, 50th. But realtors always say it's location, location, location. And I always remind broadcasters, and the good ones I don't have to remind, it's local, local, local. The only thing, if you want to stay relevant and you want to be important in your community, you will be local. When satellite radio first came out, I remember my friend Eddie Fritz, who was the former president of the National Association of Broadcasters, telling a story about a guy saying, well, you know, I can get in my car in New York and drive all the way to Los Angeles and never have to change the radio dial. And he said, I looked at him and said, how often do you drive from New York to Los Angeles? And I'm exactly the opposite. I don't care. I can listen to those things anywhere I want. But what it does is if you're local, it's not going to be a threat. There is an opportunity because there is so much competition in the business. I was thinking last night, I'll tell you, the thing that I kept thinking last night, when I said, well, you know, Ed had the first radio station in Butte, he had the first television station, and for the longest time he had the only station. I thought, is there not one of my broadcasters out there who would give their eye teeth to be the only radio station or television station in their market with no cable, no satellite, you know, no internet, and I own the market of, man, can you imagine what a field day that must have been? You know, great challenges, but great opportunities, and that's what I think the internet brings. But I think it's great and empowering for citizens, and I don't see it as a threat unless you ignore it. And that becomes an issue, of course, because there are royalty issues, and when I say we have to monetize, we have to figure out how to pay for it, because streaming royalties are considerably higher than broadcast royalties. And if you've followed any of the, you know, most recent stuff, you know, you can follow the argument between Pandora, the streaming radio station that you can kind of pick your own stuff, and Pink Floyd, because they want lower royalties to be paid for streaming, and the artists are saying, no, this is what you negotiated. And they, of course, have no public service requirement, either perceived or regulated, and we, of course, do. And we could do a whole day just talking about whether that is perceived or regulated and the history of all of that, but you have a whole lot more interesting things to do. So, anything else? Great, thanks.
I just want to say one afterward. When Greg said, I'm going to talk about a sort of arcane area, I'm going to talk about translators. And I thought, because he told me some stories, and I said, you've got to tell these stories at the symposium, and you didn't. But I'm going to paraphrase the one you told me.
Okay.
Greg said he was sitting in his office one day, and he gets a call from someplace out in eastern Montana. And the guy calls up, and he's in a panic, and he says, we've lost our television station, and we don't know what to do. He said, we've tracked it to this little building, and it's got a name on there, and it's got a phone number. It's your phone number, and the name is Zed, or whoever there. He said, Zed's been dead for 10 years. Said, you got to help us get our translator back on the air. But what a great, great thing. And I have a little something for you as an honorarium for you to come and join us this morning. And,
well, thank you.
And Greg, all the best to you. We wish you very, very well.
I probably shouldn't say we're not going anywhere. I'm retiring, but we haven't decided. We're not planning on going anywhere, so you're going to be stuck with us. That story actually came about during the digital television transition a few years ago, and I for the life of me, I can't even remember, but I did. I got a phone call, and the guy said, can you tell me where the key to our translator building is? And I swear to God, I said, you know, I don't really mean to be disrespectful in any way, but I don't even know where your town is. This was and is the beauty of translators, in that once you get them up and they're working, unless they're on the top of XL Heights and are interfering with Channel 6, they virtually go forever. And this thing had been going for 10 years. The guy who was the maintenance guy, and in most of these little towns, these things were built by the guy who was, you know, the amateur radio guy, or maybe had the Radio Shack, or before that was the Heathkit, the little franchise that was in the back of his furniture store. And I mean, they just went forever, and nothing happened, and it's this point. And of course, the underlying thing on this, which I learned a whole lot about, was not only had they been running without an engineer for 10 years, Any of you who understand the regulations, their license had been expired for way longer than that. It had been expired for over 20 years. They hadn't renewed this license. And we found close to 100 translators in Montana that were operating completely illegally, no license, and I hired a retired engineer who's done yeoman work. He has, in the last couple of years, has converted nearly 200 of those translators to digital, and we're honoring him by putting him into our MBA Hall of Fame tomorrow night also. And one of the funniest pictures on his plaque is the one with Charlie with a mule and the antenna going up the side of a mountain to replace a translator. And he found a guy in the FCC who, and again, it's a big, big, big bureaucracy. But like anything else, if you dig deep enough and you find the right people, and there are some very good people there, and Charlie found the guy in engineering who said, if you don't tell anyone, I won't tell anyone, and we will expedite renewals of these very privately and very quietly, and they will be legal before anyone knows they were illegal. And that's exactly what we did with well over 100 of these things. Because they're not owned by us. They're owned by little, the Ferndale Television Club, the Libby Video Club. They're local groups, and that's another thing. And I'm not sure if he was part of, but I know he must have been. And this is something I remind, and I spend a lot of time sitting in the FCC and with congressional people. The first local option tax in the state of Montana was enacted in the mid-1950s to allow communities to tax themselves to create translator districts. That's how important it was to those local communities, and that's how important it remains. So, great. Thank you.
We're going to take just a moment to set up for the next panel, and Kirby, if you can help and show us how we're going to do this.
In the middle here.
Be fine.
Put you right here in the middle. You guys want some
Okay, thank you.
Don't they look distinguished? Let me make a brief introduction. Jay Cohn, and Jay, if you would just raise your hand so that you can be identified, and Vic and Bill when I call on you. Jay Cohn leads our panel discussion this morning, focusing on the formative years of broadcasting in the Treasure State. Jay has more than 30 years of broadcast news experience. He graduated from the U of M Journalism School with honors in 1976. He's worked as a congressional fellow, covered wildfires in Yellowstone and presidential inaugurations in D.C., directed the news and anchored for KXLF-TV in Butte, and today is assistant news director and co-anchor for weekday evening news at KTVQ in Billings, his hometown. Jay has been honored as Montana's Broadcaster of the Year in 2005, and the year before that scored a major EB award for the Best Program of the Year, Wild Montana. And joining Jay on the dais are two more veteran broadcasters and businessmen. Vic Miller. Vic was born and raised in White Sulphur Springs. Following service as a member of the Army Signal Corps during the Korean conflict, Vic began his broadcasting career with KOOK Radio in Billings in 1953 and moved over to KOOK-TV, which later became KTVQ. He worked there as news anchor, operations director, and then as the station's general manager for 18 years. Among many other broadcasting activities and honors, he's a past president of the Montana Broadcasters Association, and in 1998 was inducted into the Montana Broadcasters Hall of Fame. He knew and worked with Greater Montana Foundation founder Ed Craney and has been a trustee for the GMF for the past 13 years. And Bill Whitsitt. Bill is a former news director of KRTV in Great Falls. He was the creator and the first news director of the Montana Television Network News Organization. He has a PhD in public administration and taught graduate courses on public policy at George Washington University. He was also a CBS News Fellow at Columbia University, served as Chief of Staff for a U.S. Senator, and held other congressional staff positions before assuming a number of senior leadership roles in industry and trade associations. Today, Dr. Whitsitt is on the verge of retiring from his position as Executive Vice President for Public Affairs at Devon Energy Corporation in Oklahoma City and moving back to Montana. He's also the Vice Chairman of our own Greater Montana Foundation. And Bill, it's a pleasure for me to welcome you back home.
Thank you.
Gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Randy. What an awesome experience to sit on this side of this imposing bench up here. First of all, I'd like to thank the Greater Montana Foundation and the Historical Society for this great honor to be involved in this today. I feel like I'm not worthy to be up here, but our paths have crossed so many times down through the years. One of my first breaks in broadcasting was I got an internship, a Greater Montana Foundation sponsored internship at the University of Montana, and I had an opportunity to work at KXLF TV in 1974. I had opportunity to meet individuals like Paul Simitzes and Ron Cass and Jim Manning, names that echo through this room. But I remember telling my dad I was very upset that I had to go to Butte because we had stations in Great Falls and stations in Billings. I was from Billings. I had worked in radio in Great Falls, and I said, Butte? You know, all the, well, you know, what's the luck? I'll be sent to Butte. My dad said, you're going, you're going to have the time of your life. And it took me down to the bottom of the Berkeley pit one evening with a friend of mine that worked at KXLF. We got to experience the Butte economic development of the day, which was what building was going to burn down on any given night in uptown Butte. That was a big summer of '74. Little did I know that 16 years later I would be, Ron Cass would call me and ask me to be the news director at KXLF in Butte, where I got mail addressed to Bill Whitsitt, Ed Pice, a name, and I believe there were some mail even addressed to Ed Craney that came across the news desk there occasionally. And yes, it was in the great train station there in Butte. In 1998, I got to go to Billings and cross paths with Vic Miller, and I'm still at KTVQ. So that's like 39 years I've been working with the Montana Television Network in one way or the other. And over the years, it's just been a great career, everything from this room as the old Supreme Court chambers. I was telling people last night, one of my favorite stories about this room is Ian might remember this as well. The Supreme Court was called into a special hearing to consider a football player from C.M. Russell High School who had been disqualified from playing with 3 days to go before the playoffs. So they had an emergency hearing here. I've never seen this room this packed. It was circled there. There was standing room only, and Justice Daley comes through the door, and he had his robe on, and the justices come and sit down, and Gene Daley proceeded to scold everyone in the room that we have important matters at waiting because we have a stupid football game that someone needs a decision on. He proceeded to scold everyone in the room. So on this side of the dais and all the hearings over the years that Ian and I and all the reporters have covered here, hearing my voice echo in this room is kind of weird. Let me tell you a little bit about our gentleman here. Oh, one other thing, when I asked Bill Whitsitt to send me his bio, he mentioned that he started his career at KUDI Radio, which is where I started my radio career. I'll tell a little bit more about Bill's entry into when I worked at KUDI, we were in the little Abbey Road radio on Central Avenue in Great Falls, not the trailer house that you worked in over next to the river. But it's interesting that I grew up in Billings, listening to Cook Radio, listening to Vic, and then Bill Whitsitt, did I not know, was blazing the trail ahead of me at KUDI Radio. So it's very humbling and a big honor to be here on the dais today with these gentlemen. Vic Miller, as we've heard, was born and raised in White Sulphur Springs. He began his broadcasting career in 1953 at Cook Radio in Billings, which then became Cook TV. Over the years, Vic has been a newscaster, the operations director, general manager there for 18 years. We all know he's a past president of the Broadcasters Association and a member of the Hall of Fame of Montana's broadcasters. His wife of 57 years, Joanne, is here today, and they have 2 grown sons and 5 grandchildren, and it's my pleasure to get to introduce his commentaries almost once a week on KTVQ with Vic and his sidekick, Slab Marble. And Vic, I'm going to turn it over to you. You're going to talk about the early years of network radio and kind of the final years of that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jay. I don't claim to be a noted historian, but I'm going to take a few minutes to give you an idea of early television in Montana as seen through the eyes of someone who wasn't paying all that much attention. Later, I'll be happy to answer questions as time allows. As noted, I rolled into Billings in 1953 in October, a month before they put Cook Television on the air, and the reason that I had a job is some of the staff members from the radio station were going over into the television portion, so while I didn't have a great deal of experience, actually didn't have any experience at all, they hired me because I worked cheap. Cook TV began broadcasting about a month after I got there, November of 1953. Ed Craney had put KXLF TV on the air a couple of months earlier than that. Both Cook Radio and Cook TV were owned primarily by Charlie Crist and J. Carter Johnson. Charlie was a longtime Montana legislator. They determined the market was large enough to support a television station, which was not a given at that point in time, and could very well end up being a big black hole, because not too many people own television sets. And when the station went on the air, a black and white TV set ran about $300, which is approximately what I was grossing every month as a radio announcer for Cook Radio. When they were preparing to put the TV station on the air, there were days when they would just broadcast a test pattern. And many Billings residents had never seen a television picture before, and some of these folks who owned TV sets would just sit there for an extended period of time staring at that test pattern. I mentioned black and white televisions, and all the programs, of course, we televised were in black and white. Beginning the evening day was rather short, and just everything was either live or on film, and the station would begin telecasting at 6 o'clock at night and end about 9, or whenever we happened to run out of programming on a given day. However, from day one, they did have a 30-minute newscast called 4-Star Final, which, among other people, included a gentleman named Ed Pice, who later went on to be the general manager of KXLF TV after Joe Sample purchased that station. Our programming that first week included the Red Button Show, Heroes of the Saddle, Ringside with the Rustlers, and the biggie, the Cisco Kid. We had a television monitor at the radio station, and the television station's phone number hadn't been published in the phone book yet, so when people had a question about TV, they just called the radio station. And we had a cleaning woman named Lena, and one evening, she was out cleaning the area where we had the television monitor in the station, And Ed Pice was doing a sportscast, and Lena asked me, "Can Ed see me?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Why not? I can see him." It reminded me of a line that Bob Hope once had, that the difference between television in the United States and television in Russia was that in this country you watched the TV set, and in Russia the TV set watched you. Anyway, about a year after the station signed on, they'd expanded the broadcast day, signed on at 4 in the afternoon with the Homemaker Show, didn't sign off until 11 that night. Joe Sample later bought out Charlie Crist and the other stockholders and became the sole owner of both Cook Radio and Cook TV. And eventually, Cook TV was able to get a CBS network signal relayed from Salt Lake. The network signal was picked up at a site built near the Medicine Wheel in Wyoming, and it did give the station access to live television, although from the site in Wyoming, we occasionally had some problems, and no matter what the program was supposed to be, it looked like Pierre lost in a snowstorm. In 1958, Cook TV did the first remote baseball pickup when they televised the first game of the American Legion Little World Series. Bullet Bob Feller of Cleveland Indian fame was in town and threw out the first ball. In 58, Cook TV had competition for the first time when the people who owned KGH Radio put KGHL TV on the air. KGHL TV had the first network color signal, and they broadcast Bonanza, which was one of the first network programs in color. And a couple of years later, Cook TV was the first billing station to broadcast local programming in color. I'd moved over from Cook Radio to Cook TV at that time, and our news team each had very colorful blazers: bright yellow, bright green, bright red, bright blue. We looked like dropouts from 4 different jazz bands. But the people who own television sets damn well got color. I held on to that green blazer for a number of years and would dig it out occasionally when I was doing a commentary about either the Masters golf tournament or St. Patrick's Day. I'm not sure what happened to that green blazer. I think the moths finally put it out of its misery, which was undoubtedly a mercy killing. In my mind, the most significant change in television over the years has been the introduction of videotape. Prior to that, we did all of our commercials live, and things could get a little Western. We had whipping cream that wouldn't whip, pizzas that slid off the tray and landed on the floor. One of our most memorable disasters was when we were attempting to do a commercial featuring a Parisian street cafe setting with a table, some chairs, and pillars. Those pillars were built out of cardboard. And Jack Dunhaver had the role of the waiter. Armand Noble, who had not been with the television station all that long, was the customer in the commercial for orange juice. The camera came on, Jack walked onto the set, bumped one of the pillars, and the entire set came crashing down around Armand. Now, Dunhaver was a real pro and attempted to salvage the spot. He said, "Monsieur, would you care for a glass of orange juice?" Armand, who was about to wet his pants, nodded yes. Jack poured a glass of the juice, drank it himself, and then we went to black. In wrapping this thing up, television's proved to be our window to the world. It's enabled us to see man's first faltering tries at space exploration, followed by that day in July of 1969 when man first set foot on the moon. For better or worse, we've seen the realities of war brought into our living rooms and found out the real thing was a great deal different from an old John Wayne movie. It's a totally different business now than it was some 60 years ago. In Billings, there are 4 television stations, an endless number of signals available on cable or satellite. And looking ahead, while there may continue to be more programming sources, there probably won't be more quality programs to watch. A number of years ago, a network programmer was asked why there weren't more quality television programs on the air. He replied, "Quality hell, there ain't even enough mediocrity to go around." I appreciate your attention today. Thank you very much.
Vic, I think that blazer is still down at KTVQ. It's back in the newsroom, and we bring it out occasionally for skits. That's a true story. Dr. Bill Whitsitt, we'll just call him Bill this morning, is here as Executive Vice President for Public Affairs at Devon Energy Corporation. But as he has mentioned, he and his lovely wife are in the process of moving back to Montana, something that's been a goal for how many years now?
A long time, a long time.
Bill has had a great career, both in government and in energy, but just want to read you a little bit of the email he sent me, kind of talking about how he got started in broadcasting. He says his career began with a high school radio show as he talked KUDI in Great Falls to putting it on the air. He can talk a little bit, but the show was called Bison Review. Anybody that knows Great Falls, it's the Great Falls Bison, so I'm thinking it had something to do with this high school. And he said, once getting over being petrified by actually being on the air and seeing that Bison Review was a success, he then landed a weekend DJ shift at KFBB Radio. They were very impressed. He then paid his way through the College of Great Falls, working full-time as a DJ on KUDI under the air name of Bill Ayers. I think you can hear that voice still echoing through the Electric City today. And then eventually to KRTV with a year at American University in Washington, D.C., where he was able to make ends meet working in the communications department at NBC, WRC Radio and TV. But he's here today to talk about his job as the first news director at KRTV and the first network director for the Montana Television Network in about 1968. In 1970, he got to go to Columbia University in New York City when he won a national competition for a CBS News fellowship. And while he was there, Joe Sample shared his vision with him for the Montana Television Network and asked Bill to form its news organization. And once his fellowship was over, that's what happened. So Bill, fill us in on the missing dots on that diatribe, but just curious as to how you ended up there to Devon Energy Corporation.
Well, I can cover that, but I have to comment on a couple of things that I heard here. And thank you for that great introduction, and Randy, thank you. And I'm glad Christy is here because Christy professes to remember me as the voice of the KUDI kissing tone way back when she was a little girl. But anyway, it was mentioned that the price of a TV set, a black and white TV set, Vic, was what you earned. I literally was paid at KUDI for a month with a black and white TV set once. They didn't have any cash, and they had a trade out with one of the appliance stores, and the station program director said, "Bill, we can't pay you this week, but would you accept this little 10-inch black and white TV set?" I said, "I don't think I have a choice, right?" And then you talk about the old commercial, live commercial days on television. Dan Snyder, who I credit with the reason that I got to TV, and I could tell you a funny story or two about that, but sent me up to talk to Don Bradley about becoming an announcer on KRTV, and Don thought that would be okay, and he said he'd like to have me come up on Saturday night and do a couple of live commercials and see how I did. And so I get up there, I'm all ready to do the live commercial, and I hyperventilated. I mean, there was not a word that would come out. I was on that camera, and they went to black. And then I tried it again later, and it finally happened, but I thought my TV career is over before it even starts. But anyway, they had faith in me, and so anyway. And I'm happy to connect some dots. One of the things, though, that I did want to observe is it's really fun to be with my former colleagues and all of you here. And we had a great day and a half of Greater Montana Foundation consideration meeting. And I have to say, personally, on that score, I am very excited about where we are headed as a foundation in support of the broadcast industry in Montana. We have some new things that we are going to be experimenting with in terms of funding. We have some new possible looks at where people and how people are actually getting their information in Montana, and we're going to be, I think, maybe taking a lead in some of that. I hope so. So I'm pleased and proud to be back and almost full-time resident of Big Fork as we do all this. One of the things, though, that I did want to observe is, while it's fun for all my colleagues and I to talk about the old days, and I just get a big kick out of some of the stories I hear. I'm a relatively young guy in some of the broadcasting stuff. I only met Ed Craney once and didn't know some of the other folks, but I think the way we can best serve our state and the broadcast community, those of us who had some success and some failures, is by trying to help understand where we missed the mark and what we've learned and what we can help convey for the future to make sure that we in Montana have the best chance of the best communication, as we say in the foundation, of values, trends, and issues that are important not only today but to the future of our citizens. And so what I thought I would do mainly for just a few minutes is go back and talk about the vision really that Joe Sample had for the Montana Television Network news operation. And I want to focus on MTN because ironically there was a mistake in the first program for the symposium, and it listed me as the first or the creator of the Montana Television Network, which simply wasn't true. They had just kind of left off the last part, Montana Television Network News Organization. But I thought that's providential, and it might have been meant to happen, because what it did was focus me on something that people probably don't understand, because Joe Sample is not somebody who beats his breast and has talked a lot about MTN as far as I know. But the Montana Television Network was clearly his vision, his creation, and putting together stations that Dan Snyder and Ed Craney and others had built, and then connect them with not just a vision of efficiency or something like that, but it was with a vision of really connecting the people of Montana. So what I thought I would do is read you first a few quotes from a couple of letters that Joe Sample sent me when I was on that fellowship in New York City that I think resonate today as much as they resonated to me in 1970 when I received the first one, and then in 1971 when he convinced me that I should come back to Montana and create this new statewide news organization. So Joe wrote me a note, and this was shortly after I was named to go to New York, and he had some congratulatory things, but then he said, I want to make some comments to you about the importance of news and public affairs in broadcasting. He said, I think news is the key to a station's image. From a programming standpoint, news is certainly the major justification for local origination. That's exactly what was said by Greg earlier, and it's as true today as it was in 1970 when Joe wrote me this letter. And then he talked a little bit about his vision for connecting the stations of the Montana Television Network, and he said, I'm not seeking personal wealth. What I want by having these stations are good stations, the best we can possibly afford. We want good people, the best equipment, pleasant working conditions. To do all this takes money, and to a major extent how good our stations become will depend on how much money we're able to make. Let's freeze that thought. How important that is today. That's exactly the point that I think Ron would second, and other station people. It's the ability to turn that profit that does allow us to do the things that we know we need to do for the benefit of our listeners and our viewers and our citizens. He said, we haven't been able to afford film crews in the field and newsmen in Helena or even strengthen news operations at each station. We haven't achieved interconnection. And he went on to talk, though, about how that was his vision. It was that interconnection. So fast forward probably 10 months. I'd been in the program at Columbia, rubbing elbows with a lot of famous people and doing a lot of studying in American government. They didn't let us, by the way, take journalism because they assumed if you got to that program, you were already a journalist. What they wanted to do was to have you study things that you could then apply in your journalism career. And my choice was American government, and that's really what led to all those other things that you talked about, Jay. Anyway, Joe was more specific in this note, and he said, I want you to think about these things, and I want you to think about coming back to Montana. He said, our primary goal is the usual one. We want a superior statewide news service which will expand and supplement the wire service to the point that each of our stations will be dominant in the news area in its market. Of no lesser priority, however, is the establishment of an authoritative unifying force for the state of Montana. The viewer in Miles City must be able to comprehend the problems of the viewer in Kalispell. The state government must be able to reach all the people. We must create a new wave of understanding which will breed progressive action and tolerance. Only through an informed electorate can Montana move forward without destroying its unique assets. Wow. I mean, that is a vision. This may sound a bit high-flown, he said, or even corny, but I believe it. And I have the advantage and the frustration of watching the current legislative session. I'm not sure exactly what was going on there, but it's probably no worse than others, but no better, and the time has long passed that we can do business as usual. Montana is in trouble. No worse trouble than other areas, but certainly its predicament is less understandable in the light of examples set elsewhere. I think we can help, and I think we're the only news medium that can, at least on a consistent basis. We're in a unique position, and we have a responsibility that we must exercise. How often do we have that articulation of responsibility? If we're able to perform a service for Montana, we must be organized as on a statewide basis in terms of both technology and personnel. By the start of the new season, we will be interconnected either through common carrier microwave or by means of intercity relay stations, which we already have located between Great Falls and Butte. And then he kind of summarized by saying, we need newscasts that are so good that anyone who misses them will feel left out of the conversation the following day. He said, I don't want Forrest Anderson, who was the governor at the time, to go to bed at night without having seen our 10 p.m. newscast. And that goes for Mayor McLaughlin, Bill Cordingley of the Tribune, and even Don McClintock in Great Falls and their counterpart. That was the competing television station. We need newscasts that are that good, and we need to convince people that we have them. That means promotion and lots of it. And Joe Sample put his money where his mouth and his pen were. He promoted our Montana Television Network news, gave me a lot of latitude. In fact, he said, you know, how you do this is up to you, but I want you to come back and do it. And we had some disagreements. My belief was if we're going to be true to the local nature of news and public affairs, our newscasts can't just be originated, even if they have some material from other places, from a station. We have to go to a cut-in type arrangement where we actually can put in local news. The local station can put in its local news, its sports scores, and local weather, and those kinds of things. And I know it drove station managers like Vic Miller crazy because, and Vic, I'd love your comment on that. We've never talked about that. But all of a sudden, you were watching a clock, and we've got 6 minutes to plug in some local news, and it was a little complicated to work, and it was pretty rudimentary, but it did work. And we saw the ratings do great things, and we started making money. I know at our stations, the 6 and 10 o'clock news were always sold out, at least in Great Falls, and I'd love your thoughts, Vic, and Billings. We had a sense that we were indeed making a difference. Now, none of this would have been possible had it not been for the pioneers like Ed Craney and like Dan Snyder, who's here, and he's going to talk a little bit later. because all of us built on the foundation that they laid. Dan asking me if I would be the news director at KRTV, I was an announcer, and I said, well, I've never been a news director. And he said, that's okay, we've never had one. You know? I mean, we all were allowed to grow and to build on what we were able to achieve. And I think that's what we owe the future generations of broadcasters. And that's why I'm so excited that maybe we can take some of these lessons, the vision of Joe Sample and the others in this room, and figure out how in this wave of internet, social media, competing news sources, and I really would like to have a conversation before we're finished with this panel about some of the trends in terms of factoids versus facts and responsibility of journalists and those kinds of things. But again, I think that's what we can help contribute as we go forward. So I'm happy to take some questions or comments.
There's so many questions in such little time. I'm just curious as to how you went about hiring a staff and deciding that you were going to do that local 6-minute cut-in, and when you sat down and figured out you've got this network now, what are we going to do with it? What were those early days like? And maybe, Vic, you can comment about those early days, whether you thought it was going to work as well.
Well, we had the benefit of having stations that had news operations. And so with the exception of beefing up some of those station staff by a person or two, it wasn't a great chore. And hiring the announcer or the anchor man and a couple of extra people at KRTV, because that was the origination point for most of the news, and beginning to buy, as Joe said we would do, and he did he was pretty strict with the dollar, but he did see that we had to buy new cameras, we had to do more film at that time, we had to do more, use more technology and use it better. So it wasn't as if we were starting with a completely blank page. We had good people at, in Billings and Butte and at the KRTV news operation. It was a matter of more and higher caliber as we went forward. And recognizing that because we were interconnected and we had, or we assumed upon ourselves at least, a responsibility to do better in terms of this statewide connection approach, think of creative ways to carry that out. We started, for example, Face the State, patterned after Face the Nation, and we did the statewide Sunday interview program. We also did the first, I'll never forget, the first statewide political debate. We did that on MTN. It originated from Great Falls. It was between Lee Metcalf and Hank Hibbard. And that became a pattern. That's why we have statewide political debates now. And let me just tell you one funny story about that first debate. We didn't know how it was going to go, but we did have our stations prepared to take phone calls from viewers around the state, and they would feed them to Great Falls, and I would ask toward the latter part of the debate questions that were phoned in and all of that. So it was, the pressure was on, right? Well, Lee Metcalf walks into the studio, and he's got a manila folder, 8.5 by 11 manila folder, and he carries it with him to the stage, where we were, and we're getting ready, we're miking everybody up, and he's got this folder in his lap. Well, we weren't going to allow, one of the rules was nobody could use notes, and so I'm wondering what Lee Metcalf is doing with this folder. Well, you may remember that Lee Metcalf had a volcanic temper. I mean, if somebody said something wrong to Lee Metcalf, he was prone to just go off. And many of you knew Lee better than I, but I had seen it in action a couple of times, including during preparation for the debates. That added to the pressure. But anyway, so as we're getting mic'd up, I said to the senator, I said, Senator, do you want to put that folder down under your chair, or would you like me to take it? And he said, no, I'm just going to keep it here beside me. So all through the debate, the folder's beside him. And so at the end of the debate, everything went fine. We're getting unmiked and we're walking out, and I walk out with Lee Metcalf and I said, Senator, what's in the folder that you had there. And he opens it up, and there's a sheet of paper with a big smiley face, and written under it, "Don't let the son of a bitch make you mad."
He won the debate, and he got reelected.
The rest was history.
Vic, how about from your perspective when all this was transpiring? Did you think it was going to work? What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I had quite a bit of confidence in having it work because originally our newscast, we did not have news people. Everybody that was employed by the station also doubled on the air. I was operations director. I was doing local news. Cliff Ewing at the time was general manager. He was doing national news. Ed Pice did sports for both radio and television. And so you just come back and do the news afterwards. So it was not exactly a hotbed of professional journalism by any stretch of the imagination. So we were really looking forward to the potential that this thing had. And Bill did a superb job of making it work. And I'm extremely grateful because that happened and the ratings went up and we made a lot of money.
You know, it's interesting from my perspective, having been the Capitol Bureau Chief here at the Capitol and then the news director in Butte, to watch how the last couple of decades of the Montana Television Network, we have come full circle. I can vividly remember a meeting here in Helena over at the Department of Natural Resources when Al Nash was brought in to be our statewide news director. And he brought with him a consultant who was there to tell us that they had done a couple of surveys and they were dropping MTN. Nobody in the state knew what MTN was. And I sat there and went, really? When I call people and say, this is Jay Cohn with MTN News, they were like, yeah, well, come on over. But unfortunately, we went with the consultants at that time, took their advice, dropped the MTN. That logo went away. We became the news station. Eventually, that turned into Montana's news station. And lo and behold, just a few years ago, John Saunders, when he became the statewide coordinator, said, we're bringing the MTN logo back, and now we all call ourselves the Montana Television Network again. And we've updated the little MTN logo. But a lot of us still have the MTN ties. I know Ian has one. I forgot to bring mine this morning. I'm kicking myself when I was in Butte. Real quickly, I want to mention that I was there when they dedicated the building in Uptown Butte as the National Historic Site, and I think the Craney family was there. We got to film that. And one of the interesting things I'd like you to talk about, both of you, is the technology a little bit back in the day. A real quick funny story, when I was interning at KXLF in 1974, they trained me to run the film processor because Don Scheidecker, who was our production guy and the film guy, was taking a vacation, and he was the only one in the building that knew how to run the film processor. So as the intern, I got to learn how to do that, which involved mixing chemicals in great big 10-gallon barrels and stuff. It was quite a process. So Don Scheidecker went on vacation. I went in. Everything went fine because, you know, if the film didn't process, you had no news. You were pretty much a 30-minute reader. The next morning, as I came in the building, the train station in Butte, there was a funny smell. And I could hear Paul Simitzes in his office just ranting and raving. I can't believe who is responsible for this? Well, within a matter of minutes, I was in his office. I had run the processor perfectly, but I had forgot to close all the valves. So overnight, they all evaporated, and the entire train station smelled like a photography shop. And that was a very expensive mistake that Mr. Simitzes told me in no uncertain terms, if I wasn't a paid intern from the Greater Montana Foundation, I would fire you right now. So I survived that mistake. But talk a little bit about the technology, because even in my time, we've gone from film to video. One of my first jobs here at the Capitol was dragging the first video camera around with a little golf cart that had the tape recorder on it. Now we don't have tape. When I talk to our new employees about, well, I think we have a tape with that on, they go, tape? Scotch tape? What are you talking about? So, Bill, and Vic, how about your technology? When you went to cover the quake, 1959 Yellowstone earthquake, you just had a little tape recorder, right?
Right. No, it has changed immensely. And quite frankly, I was in the control room at KTVQ last week. I looked up on the wall, and there were 50 monitors. And everybody had their back toward the studio. When we started, it had to be line of sight because the switcher had to see what was going on out there. And it has changed immensely. I frankly don't understand what's happening in television today, but fortunately I don't have to because I only work 2 minutes a week. I go in at 10 o'clock in the morning every Thursday, tape a 2-minute commentary, and at the end of the month they send me some beer money, and it's a heck of an arrangement. But everything has changed so much. Like you say, I still refer to it as tape, and everybody looks at you like you had two heads, but it's an evolving thing.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing at MTN was the purchasing of new handheld Canon sound on film cameras, right?
Right.
Instead of the old crank up, still or silent stuff with the tape recorder, we actually were able to buy these really cool cameras, right, where you could record right onto the film, and that was amazing. That allowed us to come over to Helena during the legislative session, for example, and do our filming at the time, and without having to worry about as Dan knows, the wide videotape. I mean, we actually had a tape machine in a bus. It took that bus to haul that tape machine around when we were a few years earlier doing remotes, and we'd have to trail a generator behind the bus if we were going to do anything, out in the country. But anyway, that was a real breakthrough because then we could come over, we could do our filming, and if we got back early enough in the afternoon, we could process that film, we could, edit, and we could have something from the legislature on for the network that day. In some cases, we would, because we had pretty good relationships with a lot of people in the community, including the manager of the Northwest Airlines terminal, we could actually ask a pilot to put film if one of our reporters, say up in Kalispell, had a story or something. If there was a plane, a Big Sky Airlines or something coming to Great Falls, we'd ask him to pilot, to carry the film back, and we'd go up to the airport and get it and process it and all that kind of stuff. So we got very creative, but I mean, it was very primitive. Today, with the technology, obviously, and all of the ways that this is made so much easier, and there are so many more capabilities that even an average citizen can take advantage of in terms of video clips. And by the way, in the work I do now, we use video a lot. We have an in-company video HD editing capability because we do video clips on our intranet in the company, and we also have a studio where we can put our executives on Cavuto or Fox News or CNN from our company location. And they love it, and so it's not unusual for us to get a call at 10 in the morning and ask if we can have our CEO do a 2-minute question and answer on network television, and he goes down to the 3rd floor, and boom, we're linked, and we're on. And a lot of companies are doing that. So that adds to the immediacy, and it also adds to the vibrancy of a lot of what we do today.
I see we have about 15 minutes. There might be some questions. Anybody have a question? I'd just like to hear from the audience a little bit because we could talk about the early years. Ian and I were laughing. I see, Jay, they have you moderating the early years panel. But you talk about when we ran the Capitol Bureau here, we would have to run our tape to the airport, put it on the plane so it would get to Billings in time. And we had a close relationship with the guys behind the counter who would actually, some days, if they were feeling like it, would run out and toss the tape up to the pilot who would take it. And then, so it hasn't changed all that much from the years. And as far as this new technology being easier and friendlier, that kind of just depends on the day, I think. We all have many horror stories. Norma?
Norma, that's something I've been trying to forget for 40 years. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. It's one of, I will. Norma, in fact, it's one of my fondest memories, actually. But I have this certificate they gave me when I left KRTV to go to grad school that one of the things that I was being cited for was my ability to keep my cool when being kissed by a bevy of beauties. Well, Dan was celebrating with a reception in the studio our going color. And so we were doing a color newscast. I was doing the weather. And there was champagne that had been flowing, I think, shall we say, at the reception and I was doing the 10 o'clock news. And so I don't know whose idea it was, but all of a sudden, a number of the very nice, sharp-looking young ladies in the station were coming up one by one and giving me a kiss on the cheek as I was trying to talk about that cold front coming down, you know. And you know, I would handle it a lot differently today if it happened. Then I was petrified and just kept doing the weather. And they finally went to black, and anyway, but yeah, those were the, I don't know that could happen again today.
Denise? Sure.
I'm pretty concerned about it, Denise. I see good things happening here in Montana, but it is, in my estimation, spotty. And I spent a lot of time looking at the research and looking at a lot of different news approaches and those kinds of things by both avocation and vocation. It's part of my job. And I would say that in journalism, we have gotten so far over, in general, and I'm not making a blanket statement about every journalist, but there is so much now of what passes for journalism that's really either time-filling or advocacy that it bothers me a great deal. When I went to Columbia, even though they didn't want us to take journalism class, I snuck into and took a Fred Friendly class. Fred was one of the pioneers of journalism, and it was one of his last classes. It was for the full time I was there. And one of the things that really sunk into me is that we as journalists have a responsibility to be, yes, fair, to be balanced, to be as objective as we can, knowing we are not perfect. But the most important element or the value that they tried to impart to us was you need to put things in context. And we've gotten away from that, it seems to me. Nowadays, the technology is so easy to get a film clip of Joe Blow and a film clip of Sam Black and juxtapose them and claim we're being fair, when in fact, Joe Blow may have a very distinct agenda and no knowledge of a subject, and you may have somebody over here who is a well-respected research scientist who really has done the work and is trying to convey something that is absolutely factual, but in the two 10-second clips, they come across as equal. There's no context. And so that's very troubling to me. The other thing that I would say in terms of the journalism is, and I didn't coin this, but it has always stuck with me, and I taught this in my grad school classes on public policy. We have evolved from watchdog journalism in large measure before the Vietnam War and that era, where we had a strong legacy of pointing out issues and problems, but in a fair, contextual way, to really, and before that, it was what some people have called lapdog journalism, where we would just repeat whatever the powers said, and that was, we took it at face value. Then we went to the watchdog journalism, which was kind of my era. We tried to, if there were issues, point them out, but if there were good things, point those out too, and that was the context. But now we're in junkyard dog journalism. Now it's journalism often, not always, but often for impact and for entertainment value. We have organizations. I've told William Marcus, one of the ones that I really have a problem with these days is ProPublica. It is not a journalism organization. It is an advocacy journalism organization. And there are others on all parts of the spectrum. But that to me is very troubling. And so I think we need to impart to our upcoming journalists the notion that you have a responsibility, again, to put things in context.
Vic?
One of the problems is the fact that we have Fox, we have MSNBC, we have other organizations where you have hosts of programs who are not newscasters. And the line between news and commentary becomes very blurry. And in the minds of a lot of people who watch these shows, they can't tell the difference between what is news, what is opinion. And that troubles me a great deal. I have watched the news in recent years. I am on KTVQ. I am not with KTVQ, so I can look at it pretty objective in a lot of ways. And I have been impressed with the quality of the young people who are working at that station right now. And we have had the good fortune over the years to have extremely talented people come through the door and work for that station over the years. Probably, I'd say 2 of the 3 most talented people we've ever had, strangely enough, were children of publishers of the Billings Gazette. The first one was Susan Rosian, who worked for us for a while, went on and later was a co-anchor for KABC in New York. Then went to CNN and did much of the coverage of the flood damage in New Orleans. The other is the son of Bruce Wittenberg. Jake Wittenberg is one of the brightest people that's ever come through, very articulate, and I would be amazed if he doesn't end up with a major network at some future time. And it's really gratifying, and it always has, and I think Bill would agree, that you get someone who's extremely talented, and they tell you they're going to leave, and you have mixed emotions because you hate to lose them, and yet you wish them the best of everything, and you hope they have a tremendous career. So it's always a bittersweet experience.
Bill?
Hey, one other
You bet.
observation, and I want to put a shameless plug in for the Greater Montana Foundation here on this very point, because having just had our meeting and seen a lot of the work that's being done, as I said at the start of my previous comments, in Montana we see some very good things happening. The people that are in this room, there are lots of people I'd miss somebody if I tried to name them all, are coming forward with programs from the university system, from commercial stations, and we are funding a number of them that really do meet the tests that I tried to articulate, ones that are done not only technically well, and they are really superb programs, but they also try to address these issues, trends, and values that we in the foundation want Montanans to be able to see and feel and judge for themselves, but they do it in a way that allows a choice among viewers and listeners.
Ian?
I want to have you address the other part of Denise's question, which was what I was going to ask anyway. Going from the early days when just everybody doubled up and somebody did news and somebody did something else, the evolution to a truly professional news organization. Is there a point you can look at and say, this is where that happened? Or did it evolve over time? Just describe it.
In my limited experience, right, it happened at KRTV, where we had a great guy who was running a news department at a radio station who would come up and read the news, to when I was made the first full-time news director and realized I had a responsibility then to really dig into this and become a journalist. And so that was just one little anecdote. And then we were able to take that much further with the MTN, because as Joe said, if I had read you that part of the letter, he said, I am not going to manage, we are not going to manage the news organization. You're going to have to make it succeed or fail. And wow, I mean, then at that point, there was no backsliding. We knew that we had a responsibility to turn this into, or make it a professionally running operation with values, with some goals and objectives, and you know, is this just a different form of entertainment? And sometimes it was, you know, but what are the real responsibilities? So in my experience, it was really those two benchmarks. The first at KRTV, and then the second, really the MTN news operation took it to a whole new level.
I think we began hiring actual news people with the start of the Montana Television Network. In addition to, I mentioned when I was operation director, I also did local news. When you weren't on camera, you went back and ran camera. So it wasn't too glamorous, but it was educational.
Were those folks transition from radio to television and then had to learn the TV part of it, or were you hiring actual college-trained broadcasters?
At MTN, they were all college trained with some experience. Now, the experience part might have been in radio, but we focused on journalists or broadcast professionals who had evolved into the news business.
Tom.
Well, all that had subsided by the time I really began my news career. Anaconda, I still remember the Anaconda smelter in Great Falls, and a lot of my friends, when I grew up in high school there, their families worked there and all that. But the political influence or the power, by that time, it was pretty diffused. And I never had a single instance, even though we did some stories that Montana Power and Anaconda didn't like periodically, but we tried to do them in a fair way, and I was never told by station management or by anybody in the community or in the state, boy, you're really on the wrong track, you've got to back off. That never happened. And I didn't feel like that would ever happen if we did our jobs well.
One point I might make is there's always some controversy when one of your major sponsors is cast in an unfavorable light by your news department. And when I was general manager, I never told the news department, you should not do this story because it might harm us. What I did say is, if you're going to do a controversial story, I want to know about it before it goes on the air, because I do not want to get a phone call from some guy that says, what do you idiots think you're doing? And I wanted to know what idiots thought we were doing before it went on the air.
And being one of the idiots,
Well, I see Randy's giving me the sign to wrap things up, so great questions, great panel, good discussion. Wish we had another hour and a half, but we'll wrap it up with that. Thank you very much, Vic and Bill.
Jay and Vic and Bill, thank you very much for an extremely informative and entertaining first panel. You know, as you were going through that, I'm thinking to myself, this is being taped, and I hope that we have some young journalists and broadcasters who are out there who will be able to watch this, because some of the wisdom you gave was absolutely brilliant. Thank you. As you dismount, I have a small memento for each of you for joining us. So thank you again, and want to just point out that we're going to take a brief refreshment break. All we have to do is go out that rear door. Kirby says we head to the right. Is that correct? And we have coffee and some some snackies as you exit the chamber. We're a couple of minutes behind, so why don't we plan on falling back in here at 10 minutes after 11, and go ahead and finish up your coffee and donuts before you come back in, because no liquids are allowed in here. And we'll be back at 11, what did I say, 11:10? 11:10. We'll see you then.